The water is revealing things that were never meant to be seen again. A World War II landing craft, sitting in the mud miles from shore. The entire town of St. Thomas, submerged in 1938, now ghosting back into the sunlight. And inside a rusty barrel, lodged in the sucking clay of Hemingway Harbor, the skeletal remains of a man, shot in the head sometime in the 1970s. A mob hit, buried for decades under billions of gallons of water, until the water wasn't there anymore. Lake Mead is not just shrinking, it is exposing its secrets. It is a time capsule being opened in reverse, and every new discovery, every sunken boat and forgotten foundation, is a warning. This is not a story about a drought. This is a story about a fundamental miscalculation made a century ago. A math error that built the modern American West, and now threatens to unmake it. What do you think is the most shocking thing to be revealed from the shrinking lake? Let us know in the comments below. 7 states, 2 countries, and 40 million people all drink from the same river, and that river is running out of time. So many of you who watch our documentaries say you get lost in the story and forget to subscribe. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It's a small click, but it's the single most important thing you can do to support this channel and ensure we can keep making these stories. It is an emergency for us. Let's begin. The promise was written on paper on November 24, 1922. They called it the Colorado River Compact. 7 states, desperate to tame the wild artery of the desert, gathered to divide its bounty. They measured the flow, they did the math, and they allocated 15 million acre-feet of water between them. 7.5 million for the upper basin states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. 7.5 million for the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, and California. Later, another 1.5 million would be promised to Mexico. It was an engineering dream put to paper, a blueprint for turning desert into paradise, for building cities where there was only sand, and growing crops where there was only sun. There was just one problem. The math was wrong. The measurements they used to make that promise, the very flow data that underpinned the entire legal foundation of the American Southwest, were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. They were basing the future of 40 million people on a flood. They had promised more water than the river actually had. It was a structural deficit, a debt of water that would go unpaid for decades. For a long time, it didn't matter. Hoover Dam rose from the Black Canyon between 1931 and 1936, a monument of concrete and ambition. It pinned the Colorado River and created Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States. Upstream, Glen Canyon Dam would do the same, creating Lake Powell. These 2 reservoirs acted as the nation's water bank accounts for the West. For decades, they held so much water that the original sin of the 1922 Compact was just a footnote in a history book. In 1983, and again in 1999, Lake Mead was essentially full, its water level kissing the 1,229-foot mark. The system worked. The cities grew. The faucets ran. The desert bloomed. It seemed limitless. It was not limitless. It never was. A century-old mistake was about to meet a 21st-century reality, and the evidence of that collision is now etched onto the canyon walls 100 feet high, a white scar on the rock. They call it the bathtub ring. It's not a stain. It's a mineral crust of calcium carbonate, a tombstone marking where the water used to be. Every foot of that ring represents billions of gallons of water, gone. It is the physical proof of a promise the river could never keep. A single river system gives life to a population larger than Canada's. 40 million people depend on the Colorado. It's the water that fills glasses in Los Angeles, irrigates fields in Arizona's Imperial Valley, and keeps the lights on in Phoenix. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend, but it is built on a simple, brutal hierarchy. Not all water rights are created equal. The 1922 Compact and the laws that followed created a complex system of seniority. California got the largest share and the most senior rights. Arizona, particularly the Central Arizona Project, got junior rights. And Nevada, the state home to the glittering oasis of Las Vegas, received the smallest allocation of all. Just 300,000 acre-feet. A sliver. It's one of the most persistent myths of this crisis, that the fountains of the Bellagio and the sprawling resorts of the Las Vegas Strip are the villains. The truth is something else entirely. Nevada takes only about 4% of the river's main allocation, and Las Vegas itself has become a world leader in water conservation, Under the visionary, if sometimes ruthless, leadership of former water chief Pat Mulroy, the so-called water czarina, the city did something radical. It started paying its residents to tear out their lawns. It passed laws banning ornamental grass. And most importantly, it engineered a system that captures, treats, and returns nearly 99% of all indoor water back to Lake Mead. Every gallon used in a sink, a shower, a toilet, goes back into the lake, where the Southern Nevada Water Authority gets a return flow credit to use it again. It's a closed loop, an act of hydrologic recycling on a metropolitan scale. The real user of the Colorado River is not a city, it's a farm. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of the river's water goes to agriculture, much of it to grow thirsty crops like alfalfa and cotton in the middle of the desert, crops that are often shipped overseas. We are, in effect, exporting the water of the American West, one bale of hay at a time. It's a system that made sense in 1922. It is a system that is pushing the river to the breaking point in 2024. Knowing that agriculture uses 80% of the water, does that change how you view the crisis? Let me know in the comments. The year 2000 was the beginning of the end of the old world. That's when the megadrought began. Scientists like Park Williams at UCLA would later analyze tree ring data and confirm it. The 22-year period starting in 2000 was the driest stretch the Southwest had seen in at least 1,200 years. And this wasn't a normal drought. This was something different. A fundamental shift in the climate. What scientists call aridification. The region isn't just dry, it is becoming a different place, a hotter, thirstier place. A warmer atmosphere acts like a sponge. It pulls more moisture from the snowpack before it can melt into the river. It sucks more water out of the soil, and on a hot, windy day over Lake Mead, it pulls over 1 billion gallons of water straight into the air through evaporation alone. 1 billion gallons, gone, every single day. As the lake fell, the past began to surface. In 2022, the water dropped below 1,050 feet, exposing the city's original water intake valve from 1971. A piece of infrastructure that was supposed to last forever was now high and dry. Then came the boats. A sunken B-29 Superfortress bomber that crashed in 1948. A Higgins-craft landing boat, the same kind that stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, lost during a survey mission decades ago. These were curiosities. Ghosts from a submerged past. Then came the bodies. On May 1st, 2022, a boater spotted a corroded barrel stuck in the mud. Inside were human remains. Las Vegas Metro Police detectives determined the victim had been shot, likely in the late 1970s or early 80s, stuffed in the barrel and dumped in the lake. It was a classic mob execution, a story straight from the city's dark past. And it was only possible to find because the lake had receded so far, exposing a gravesite that was meant to be permanent. More remains would follow, a grim, forensic accounting of the water level's decline. The lake was falling, and it was taking the region's sense of security with it. Every foot of exposed shoreline was a reminder. The system was failing. For decades, the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages the dams, had operated like a quiet utility. It released water, generated power, and managed a system that seemed to run itself. By June of 2022, that quiet era was over. The agency's commissioner, Camille Kalamlim-Touton, sat before a tense Senate committee and delivered an ultimatum. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the 7 basin states. She told them they had 60 days. 60 days to come up with a plan to collectively cut their water use by an unprecedented 2 to 4 million acre-feet, an amount so vast it represents nearly the entire annual water use of Arizona and Nevada combined. If the states couldn't agree on how to do it, she warned, the federal government would act unilaterally. It would impose cuts itself. It was a declaration of emergency, a line in the sand. The decades of polite negotiations and incremental steps were over. The system was now so close to failure that the federal government was threatening to take control of the spigot. Think about that for a second. Millions of people, entire state economies, were being threatened with losing the ability to use water that they considered legally theirs. Please, do us a favor and share this video with your family and friends, and make sure to hit that like button. It helps us a lot. The ultimatum set off a brutal, public negotiation. The states, which had spent a century fighting over every drop, were now locked in a room and told to sacrifice. The fault lines were immediate. J.B. Hamby, representing California, pointed to his state's senior water rights, a legal shield that theoretically protected them from the deepest cuts. California argued that those with junior rights should bear the brunt of the pain first. That put Arizona directly in the crosshairs. Tom Bushatsky, the director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, was in an impossible position. His state's lifeblood, the Central Arizona Project, or CAP, is a 336-mile-long canal that carries Colorado River water to Phoenix and Tucson. But the CAP holds some of the most junior water rights on the entire river. Under existing agreements, Arizona was already facing the largest mandatory cuts. Now, they were being asked for more. For Arizona, this wasn't an abstract negotiation. It was about the survival of its two largest cities. And then there was Nevada, represented by John Ensminger, the pragmatic head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Nevada had the smallest allocation, but the most to lose in terms of perception. Ensminger had been sounding the alarm for years, continuing the work of his predecessor, Pat Mulroy. He pointed to Las Vegas's aggressive conservation and recycling programs. He argued that his state was already doing more with less than anyone else. They had seen this crisis coming. They had spent billions to prepare. In 2020, years before Teuton's ultimatum, Las Vegas had completed one of the most audacious engineering projects in modern American history. They called it the third straw. Knowing their two existing water intakes would one day be left stranded by the falling lake, the city spent $1.5 billion to drill a new tunnel, 3 miles long, bored through solid rock, deep beneath the floor of Lake Mead itself. It terminated at an intake structure, sitting at an elevation of 860 feet. That number is critical. It is below the 895-foot mark of dead pool, the point at which water can no longer flow past Hoover Dam. It was an insurance policy against the apocalypse, a way for Las Vegas to keep pulling water even if the reservoir had functionally collapsed. The project was proof that Nevada took the threat seriously, but it didn't create new water. It just secured access to the last drops of the old. The 60-day deadline came and went. The states failed to reach an agreement. The fight was no longer about managing a river. It was about allocating a shortage that was accelerating toward a series of terrifying thresholds. There are numbers that keep water managers awake at night. They aren't projections. They are elevations, points of no return etched into the engineering of the dams themselves. The first is the minimum power pool. At Hoover Dam, this level is around 950 feet above sea level. Below this elevation, the water pressure is no longer great enough to spin the massive turbines that generate electricity for millions of people across Nevada, Arizona, and California. Power production doesn't just decline, it stops entirely. By 2022, with the lake at 1,040 feet, power generation had already dropped by a third. The dam was getting weaker. The power pool was no longer a theoretical danger. It was the next stop on the way down. The second number is the one that means catastrophe. 895 feet. This is dead pool. At this elevation, the water level in Lake Mead drops below the lowest outlets in Hoover Dam. Water can no longer pass through the dam by gravity. Nothing flows downstream. The river, for all intents and purposes, stops. California, Arizona, and Mexico would be cut off. The system, as it has existed for nearly a century, would cease to function. In late July of 2022, Lake Mead hit its record low, 1,040.71 feet, just 45 feet above the level where power generation would begin to shut down. Just 145 feet above total system failure. 2 decades of drought had drained the reservoir to just over a quarter of its capacity. A lake that was supposed to be a symbol of American ingenuity had become a symbol of its vulnerability. The bathtub ring was no longer a curiosity. It was a countdown clock. The federal government, facing the state's failure to agree, declared a Tier 2A shortage for 2023. The cuts became deeper. Arizona would lose over 500,000 acre-feet of its water, more than a fifth of its total allocation. Nevada would lose 25,000 acre-feet. The machinery of the shortage protocol was grinding forward, forcing conservation through brute force cuts. The system was working as designed in a crisis, but the crisis was outpacing the design. The projections showed the lake continuing to fall through 2023 and 2024, pushing ever closer to the power pool and dead pool triggers. The West was staring into the abyss. And then, the weather changed. The winter of 2022-2023 was not normal. It was biblical. a series of powerful atmospheric rivers, plumes of immense moisture drawn from the Pacific, slammed into the western United States one after another. They dumped record-breaking snow on the Rocky Mountains, the headwaters of the Colorado River. The snowpack in the upper basin swelled to levels not seen in decades, in some places exceeding 150% of the median. As spring arrived, the great melt began. Torrents of water, the lifeblood of the river, poured into the parched system. Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir that had been flirting with its own power pool crisis, began to rise dramatically. Water managers at the Bureau of Reclamation made a critical decision: release more water than planned from Glen Canyon Dam down to Lake Mead. The effect was stunning. Lake Mead, which had been in a terrifying freefall, began to climb. It rose over 20 feet in a matter of months. Boat ramps that had been acres from the water's edge were submerged again. The shoreline crept back up the canyon walls, covering the lower portions of the bathtub ring. The media headlines were jubilant. The drought was over. The crisis was averted. For a moment, the entire region exhaled. It was a reprieve. It was not a solution. Scientists and veteran water managers urged caution. One wet winter, they warned, does not erase 23 years of drought. The reservoirs were still less than half full. The massive structural deficit, the gap between what was promised in 1922 and what the river actually provides, remained. Climate scientist Brad Udall at Colorado State University put it simply: the atmosphere itself is now thirstier, and it's pulling more water out of the system before it ever reaches the reservoirs. The long-term trend was unchanged. The unexpected bounty did something crucial, however. It bought time. It pushed the immediate threat of Deadpool off the table. In May 2023, with the specter of federal intervention still hanging over them, and the temporary relief of a wet winter providing political cover, the three lower basin states finally did what they had failed to do a year earlier. Arizona, Nevada, and California announced a landmark consensus deal. They agreed to voluntarily conserve an additional 3 million acre-feet of water by the end of 2026. In exchange, they would receive over $1 billion in federal funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to compensate farmers and districts for fallowing land and improving efficiency. It was a historic compromise, a temporary truce in a century-long water war, but the deal itself was another sign of the new reality. They weren't dividing a surplus. They were paying people not to use water that no longer existed. It was an admission that the river was permanently smaller. By the way, I know this is the second time I'm asking, but the data tells us that a huge number of you who love our content are not subscribed. We need you. Hitting subscribe is the fuel that lets us spend hundreds of hours on research and scripting for videos like this one. It's an emergency for independent channels like ours. Please, take 1 second and click that button. It means the world. The temporary peace bought by the 2023 winter and the subsequent state deal has shifted the focus to the final showdown: the renegotiation of the rules that will govern the river after 2026. Everything is on the table. The foundational assumptions of the 1922 Compact, the concept of seniority, the massive allocation for agriculture, the very way water is valued and used across the West. The fundamental conflict has not changed. California still holds the most powerful legal rights. Farmers in places like the Imperial Valley see any reduction as an existential threat to their livelihood and to the nation's food supply. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas argue that you can't dry up metropolitan areas of millions of people, regardless of who has senior rights. It is a collision of law, economics, and the basic human need for water. What happens if the next drought is not 23 years long, but 50? Paleoclimate research, drawn from ancient tree rings, shows that the Colorado River Basin has endured megadroughts in the past that make our current crisis look mild. The period that the 1922 Compact was based on appears more and more not just as a wet period, but as a profound anomaly. The architects of the West built their world during a flood. We are now living in the drought that followed. The engineering that defined the 20th century, the massive dams, the sprawling canals, can only manage the water that is there. It cannot create it. Solutions for the 21st century look radically different. Large-scale desalination plants, though brutally expensive and energy-intensive. Advanced water recycling that turns sewage into drinking water, a concept once dismissed as toilet to tap, but now being adopted by cities across the Southwest. And, most contentiously, a permanent reduction in agricultural water use, forcing a rethinking of what we grow and where we grow it. Las Vegas's third straw is a perfect metaphor for this moment, an incredible feat of engineering, a desperate, multi-billion-dollar gamble to reach the last accessible drops of a dwindling supply. It guarantees that Las Vegas will have water even if Hoover Dam goes dry. But it does nothing for the 38 million other people on the river. It does nothing for the farmers in Arizona. It does nothing for the households in Los Angeles. It is an act of municipal survival, not regional salvation. The crisis has been temporarily paused. The water level in Lake Mead stabilized, hovering around 1,066 feet in early 2024, about 34% full. The immediate danger has passed, but the bathtub ring remains, a 160-foot reminder of how much is missing. It's a physical monument to a system that is still over-allocated, overused, and living on borrowed time. The wet winter of 2023 was a lucky break, a moment of grace. It was not a solution. The river is still draining, just more slowly now. The clock is still ticking, it just has a few more years on it. The negotiations for what happens after 2026 will determine the future of the American West. It will be a fight over scarcity, a fight over who gets to survive and who will be forced to sacrifice. Every solution is painful. Every outcome will create winners and losers, and all of it will happen under the shadow of a hotter, drier climate that is fundamentally changing the rules of the game. The water that buried a mobster's secrets for 40 years is gone. The question now is whether the society built on that water will disappear with it. I know we've bugged you a couple of times, but if you've made it this far, you are clearly one of the most dedicated viewers on the platform, and for that, we need your help. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. It's the only way we beat the algorithm and continue telling stories this important. It's a click for you, but it's a lifeline for us. Thank you. The 20th century was about conquering the Colorado. The 21st will be about learning to live with what's left of it. The engineering marvels of the past, Hoover, Glen Canyon, were built with a certainty that now feels naive. The belief that nature could be bent to human will, indefinitely. That belief is now gone, evaporated into the desert air, along with trillions of gallons of water. The future will require a different kind of ingenuity. Not just engineering, but humility. The humility to accept that the river is not what it once was, and the courage to make decisions that reflect that new, harsher reality. The story of Lake Mead is the story of us, facing